Dr. James Monroe, a successful black surgeon, finds himself unjustly targeted during a routine traffic stop in a small southern town. What begins as racial profiling escalates into harassment and abuse of power by Captain Daniels, a police officer fueled by prejudice. Despite his calm demeanor and professional status, James is subjected to humiliation, threats, and fabricated charges, all because of the color of his skin. As tensions rise, the story exposes the systemic racism and corruption within the local police force, forcing James to decide whether to fight back or risk losing everything he's worked for. The darkness clung to the winding mountain road like a heavy shroud, the narrow path barely illuminated by the weak glow of Emma Carter's headlights. Each turn felt sharper, each shadow deeper, as the lone SUV crawled through the thick, suffocating fog. Emma's hands gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white against the black leather, while the low hum of the radio did little to cut through the eerie silence. In the back seat, her 10-year-old son, Ethan, was curled up beneath his favorite blanket, his small face turned toward the window. The long drive had lulled him to sleep hours ago, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts, and the mounting unease growing in the pit of her stomach. The GPS flickered suddenly, the digital map freezing before blinking out completely. "Great, just great." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced at the screen, now a pale, useless gray. She'd driven this road before, but not in years, and not in conditions like this. Her mother's old house sat on the far side of the mountain, hidden among trees that whispered secrets to the wind. It was a place she had sworn she would never return to, but when the call came that her mother was gone and the house needed sorting, Emma found herself packing up her life in the city and heading back to a place she'd buried deep in her memories. A place she no longer trusted. Her phone buzzed faintly in the cup holder, breaking the silence. She reached for it, her thumb unlocking the screen to reveal a single text message. "Turn back." Emma frowned, her pulse skipping slightly. The message had no contact name, no explanation. She stared at it for a moment, the tiny, ominous words blurring slightly as the fog seemed to press closer against the windows. Another message appeared. "You're not alone." Her breath hitched. Emma snapped her head up, her eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. The back seat was empty save for Ethan's small form, still asleep. She glanced out the side window and then to the road ahead, but the darkness remained unbroken, the silence heavy. It was just her imagination, or maybe a prank, a wrong number sent by some troll with nothing better to do. But as Emma turned her attention back to the road, a figure stepped out of the fog. A man. She slammed the brakes hard, the SUV screeching to a stop just inches from the shadowy figure standing dead center in the middle of the road. Her heart hammered in her chest as she fumbled for her seatbelt, craning her neck to get a better look. The man didn't move. He stood tall and still, his face obscured by the hood of a heavy jacket, his posture unsettlingly calm for someone who'd nearly been run over. For a moment, the two of them remained frozen in a silent standoff, the SUV's headlights painting him in a cold yellow glow. Emma's mouth went dry as the figure slowly lifted a hand and pointed toward her, and then toward Ethan. Her stomach dropped. Before she could react, the man turned and walked off the road, disappearing back into the fog like he'd never been there at all. Emma's breathing was uneven as she gripped the wheel, forcing herself to steady the shiver that coursed through her body. "Just keep driving. Don't stop." Her foot pressed down on the accelerator, the SUV lurching forward as the road stretched endlessly into the dark. But no matter how far she drove, the unease never faded, and the words from her phone echoed in her mind. "Turn back. You're not alone." The hum of tires against the cracked pavement was the only sound as Dr. James Monroe eased his silver Mercedes S-Class down the uneven main street of Crandall, Georgia. The town was small, a place where every face looked familiar, and every road led to the same rusty diner, a gas station with pumps that predated smartphones, and the local courthouse James had passed through here many times as a boy, when his father would drive the family up to their grandmother's place for summers that always felt both endless and fleeting. Back then, the town had seemed bigger, more alive, less worn down by time. Now, Crandall felt suspended, caught somewhere between stubborn nostalgia and decay. The sign outside of Benny's diner flickered erratically, its red neon letters spelling Benny's as if mocking the thought of progress. James pulled into the nearly empty lot, his car gliding to a smooth stop beside an aging pickup truck with peeling paint and a Confederate flag sticker slapped on the bumper. The juxtaposition made him pause. James exhaled, running a hand along his neatly trimmed beard as he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Even after all these years, the memories of visiting towns like Crandall, places where his father's voice would tighten and his mother would grip his hand a little harder, still lingered. He adjusted the cufflinks on his crisp white shirt, the engraved JM catching faint light, before stepping out of the car. The air outside was warm and heavy, with the smell of fried food and faint exhaust. A dog barked somewhere down the block. James closed the door. The satisfying click of German engineering drawing the attention of two men leaning against the pickup. They looked up from their cigarettes, their gazes lingering on him longer than necessary. He ignored them, walking toward the diner with the easy confidence of a man who rarely allowed himself to be rattled. At 43, Dr. James Monroe was a name most people in Atlanta knew. Chief neurosurgeon at one of the city's top hospitals, a figure who appeared in magazines when top doctors' lists came out, and a man whose success was often prefaced by the words, "against all odds," but you wouldn't guess it to look at him now. He wore no lab coat, no polished persona. Instead, he was dressed in dark slacks and a light sweater that blended effortlessly with the simplicity of his surroundings. James liked it that way. He didn't walk with the arrogance expected of someone with his credentials, nor did he drive the sort of ostentatious car that screamed money to the wrong crowd. He lived modestly, at least outwardly. Wealth and power had never been his goal, saving lives had, but even humility couldn't disguise his presence. The bell above the diner door jangled as he stepped inside, the sound cutting through the low murmur of conversation and the clatter of dishes from behind the counter. The place was small, lit by mismatched pendant lights that swung slightly in the breeze from an overhead fan. There were no frills here, just faded booths, chipped formica tables, and stools lined up along the bar like soldiers on leave. James spotted a few faces turning toward him as he entered. Some curious, others openly cautious. He could feel their gazes as plainly as if they'd reached out and touched him. He'd been here all of 10 seconds, and already, he was something out of place. A stranger. A black man with polished shoes, in a town where men his color were usually seen, not heard. He let it roll off him. "Morning," he said casually, offering a nod to the man behind the counter. An older gentleman whose name tag read, Russell, grunted in acknowledgement. Clearly distracted by a steaming plate of eggs, he was sliding across the counter to another customer. James slid into an empty booth near the window, setting his phone face down on the table. Outside, the pickup truck men were still there, smoking and watching. He could see their shadows stretching across the lot as the sun crept higher in the sky. "Can I get you something?" The voice belonged to a waitress, early 20s, blonde ponytail, and a pen tucked behind her ear. She held a notepad in one hand and gave James the kind of tired, fleeting smile that suggested her day had started hours ago. "Coffee black," James said smoothly, "and a slice of whatever pie you've got left." The girl raised an eyebrow. "Pie for breakfast?" He smiled. "Is there ever a wrong time for pie?" That earned him a small chuckle, and she scribbled the order down. "Suit yourself." As she turned away, James felt a shift in the air, subtle, but unmistakable. He didn't have to look up to know that someone else had entered the diner. The bell jangled faintly again, and a low voice spoke near the door. "Damn shame, isn't it?" James lifted his eyes just enough to see the pickup truck men from earlier, now standing near the counter. The taller of the two was speaking to Russell, his voice loud enough to carry through the diner. "What is?" Russell asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "World's gone upside down," the man replied. He glanced briefly in James's direction, before turning back to Russell, his grin crooked and mean. "You see a man like that driving a car like that, and you gotta wonder, you know what I mean?" James's shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He could feel the weight of their attention pressing on him, like a thumb against glass. Russell frowned, glancing between the two men and James, who met the older man's gaze with quiet resolve. "Your coffee," the waitress said suddenly, appearing beside James with a steaming mug. She set it down gently, the slight tremor in her hand betraying her unease. "Thank you," James said softly. "You need anything else?" she asked quickly, her tone implying she was more concerned about his comfort than usual. "No, I'm fine." She nodded, and hurried back behind the counter, where she busied herself with wiping down trays that were already spotless. The man at the counter laughed, low and grating. "Guess manners don't cost nothing, huh?" James stared into the black surface of his coffee, its rich, bitter aroma curling upward like smoke. He took a slow sip, forcing the tension in his shoulders to ease. He'd faced this before, this same brand of low-grade hostility masquerading as conversation, words meant to provoke, to diminish, to remind him that there were places even his success couldn't touch. But James Monroe was not a man easily provoked. He folded his hands on the table, turning to look at the men with a calmness that seemed to unnerve them more than any sharp retort could have. "Is there something you gentlemen need?" he asked, his voice clear but measured. The taller man blinked as if caught off guard. "What was that?" James repeated himself, slower this time. "I asked if you needed something." Russell sighed from behind the counter. "Take it outside if you're gonna start something." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "No trouble here, Russ, just having a conversation." "Then have it somewhere else," Russell replied sharply. For a moment, nobody moved. The air felt thick and still, charged with unspoken words. Then, with an exaggerated shrug, the two men turned and pushed through the diner doors, the bell jangling in their wake. James exhaled, his hands relaxing. Outside, he watched the men climb into their truck and peel out of the parking lot, tires squealing against pavement. "Sorry about them," Russell muttered, setting a plate of pie down in front of James. "Some folks don't know when to keep their mouths shut." James offered a faint smile. "It's not your fault." Russell lingered for a beat longer before returning to his work, leaving James alone once more. The pie sat untouched as he sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the empty lot outside. Something about the encounter gnawed at him. Not the hostility itself, but the quiet sense that it was only the beginning. Some storms didn't come with thunder. Sometimes, they built quietly, gathering strength in the shadows until they were impossible to ignore, and James Monroe had a feeling that one was brewing now. James left a generous tip on the table, more out of habit than gratitude for the morning's events, and stepped back into the humid Georgia air. The sun had climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of fog, but the heat brought no comfort. It sat heavy on his shoulders as he adjusted his cufflinks and slid into his car. His phone buzzed. "Dr. Monroe, ETA." The message was from Amanda, his assistant back at the hospital. He had promised to be back in Atlanta by late afternoon to review a critical case, a young boy with a brain tumor whose surgery was scheduled for the next morning. James typed back a quick reply. "On my way soon." The exchange felt grounding, a brief reminder of the life he had built beyond places like Crandall here. People saw him and made assumptions, sometimes silently, sometimes loudly. But in Atlanta, he was a name spoken with respect. Lives depended on him, not perceptions. He was about to start the engine when the wail of sirens broke the stillness. Blue and red lights erupted behind him, the flash bouncing off his rearview mirror. James's heart sank. Turning slowly, he looked into the mirror and watched a black and white police cruiser roll to a stop just feet from his bumper. The driver's side door opened, and a tall, barrel-chested officer stepped out. His uniform was spotless, and his sunglasses reflected nothing but the glare of the sun. James took a slow breath, his fingers curling around the steering wheel before he forced them to relax. He had dealt with officers before. Most were professionals, but others were less so. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. The officer's boots crunched against gravel as he approached. A sharp rap on the window. James lowered it smoothly. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer leaned down, his mirrored sunglasses obscuring his eyes. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he stared at James for a long moment, his gaze lingering as if searching for something. "License and registration," the officer said finally. His tone was clipped, indifferent. James moved carefully, opening the glove box to retrieve his documents. "Of course," he said evenly. "May I ask what this is about?" "You match the description of someone we're looking for," the officer said. James paused mid-motion. "Excuse me?" "Driver of a suspicious vehicle reported near Main Street this morning, dark car male, black." There it was. James exhaled through his nose and handed over his license and registration. "This is my car, officer. I've just come from the diner down the street." The officer scanned the documents, his lips pressed into a thin line. Uh-huh. He straightened, taking a step back and eyeing the Mercedes like it didn't belong in his town. What brings you here? I'm visiting family property nearby, James replied, choosing his words carefully. The officer snorted faintly, an almost imperceptible reaction, but James caught it. You live in Atlanta, the officer noted, glancing at the license before looking back at James. Bit of a long way to come for breakfast, don't you think? James's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. It's not a crime to drive through Crandall, is it? The officer's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. He turned toward the cruiser. Stay here. James watched him retreat, frustration simmering beneath his carefully maintained composure. He'd done nothing wrong, nothing suspicious, and yet here he was, being treated like an intruder, a man out of place in his own country. Minutes dragged by as the officer sat in his car, running James's information. Sweat beaded on James's brow, though it wasn't the heat, it was the principle of the thing. He was a doctor, a man who had spent decades saving lives, and still, this was how they saw him. Dark car, male, black, nothing more. When the officer returned, he held James's license between two fingers, offering it back like it was contaminated. You're free to go, he said. Thank you, James replied, his voice strained with the effort it took to remain polite. He pocketed his license. But next time, officer, maybe think twice before stopping someone for no reason. The officer tilted his head slightly, his sunglasses catching the light. Careful there, he said, his voice low and hard. Don't push your luck. James's blood ran cold. He stared at the officer, torn between outrage and restraint. Finally, he nodded once, tight-lipped. Have a good day. The officer didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back to his cruiser, shoulders squared as though he'd won something. James started the engine, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out of the lot. The drive back to Atlanta was quiet, except for the sound of rubber against pavement. James kept his gaze on the road, replaying the encounter in his mind. He could feel the anger rising, anger at the injustice, at the indignity, at himself, for letting it slide with little more than a few words. But what else could he have done? Anything more might have escalated the situation, and where would that leave him on the evening news? His reputation tarnished by nothing more than an officer's whim. He rubbed his eyes, the fatigue suddenly catching up with him. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, pulling him from his thoughts. Amanda again. Update. Family of the boy wants to meet before tomorrow. Can you stop by the hospital as soon as you're back? James read the message and nodded to himself. It was a small dose of reality, a tether pulling him back to the life he'd worked so hard to build. By the time James arrived at the hospital, the day was already edging into afternoon. The lobby bustled with people, nurses in scrubs, patients being wheeled through double doors, and families huddled together, their faces creased with hope or worry. This was where James felt in control. Here, his title carried weight, his decisions saved lives, and no one dared question why he was in the building. He stepped into his office, where Amanda was waiting with a stack of files. The family's in room 206, she said, glancing up at him. Are you okay, Dr. Monroe? You look tense. James forced a smile. Just a long morning. Thank you, Amanda. He closed the door behind him and took a moment to breathe. He didn't like carrying his anger into work. It had no place here in this world. Everything was about precision, focus, and empathy. He opened the first file on his desk and began reviewing the boy's case, scribbling notes in the margins as his mind shifted fully into doctor mode. But in the quiet of his office, a single thought lingered. What happens when the world refuses to see you for who you are? James didn't have an answer. The meeting with the boy's family went smoothly. James spoke with the practiced clarity and kindness of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The boy's mother clutched his hand as he reassured her. We're going to do everything we can, he promised. Your son is in good hands. As he left the room, Amanda caught up with him in the hallway, a hint of excitement in her voice. I almost forgot, she said. The hospital board is holding a dinner this Friday to honor you, some donor event or something. They wanted me to remind you. James sighed faintly. Another dinner. Another dinner where people want to shake your hand and pretend they knew you before you were important, Amanda teased with a grin. Great. She laughed and walked off, leaving James standing in the empty corridor. For the first time all day, he smiled, a small, tired smile. But it faded quickly, because in the back of his mind, he was still parked on that cracked pavement in Crandall, Georgia, staring into the mirrored sunglasses of a man who refused to see him. The conflict hadn't ended there, it had only just begun. James Monroe stood in front of the towering glass windows of his office, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him. In the reflection, he could see the faint crease of his brow and the weary set of his shoulders. Normally, his office was a place of order, clarity, his sanctuary above the chaos, but today, it felt smaller, claustrophobic. His phone buzzed against his desk for the third time in as many minutes. He glanced at it. Unknown caller. James ignored it again. Ever since his encounter in Crandall, his phone hadn't stopped. It had begun with a local news station, leaving a voicemail. Just a small inquiry about a possible incident involving law enforcement. Then there were the social media posts. Someone must have seen the traffic stop. A blurry photo of his Mercedes under flashing lights had circulated online with captions like, "Wonder what this guy did?" or "Fancy car? Big trouble?" The phone buzzed again. "Damn it," James muttered under his breath, grabbing it. This time he answered, "This is Dr. Monroe." The voice on the other end was calm, measured. Too calm. "Dr. Monroe? This is Captain Daniels with the Crandall Police Department. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Can you come down to the station?" James froze, his pulse quickening. Captain Daniels. A name his father had mentioned decades ago, when Crandall was just a forgotten blip on his childhood map. "Why would I need to come to the station, Captain?" James asked, his voice even but sharp. "I've already been through enough nonsense this week." Daniels' tone didn't waver. "We're investigating some discrepancies from the incident on Main Street. It'd be better for everyone if you came voluntarily." James tightened his grip on the phone, his stomach twisting. He recognized the subtle threat beneath the words. "Discrepancies," James repeated flatly. "From what I understand, I was stopped without cause. That's the only discrepancy I see." Daniels didn't respond immediately. Then, coolly, "We'll be expecting you by 4 p.m., Dr. Monroe. If you don't show, we'll come find you." The line clicked dead. James stared at the phone, anger flaring in his chest like an ember catching fire. 2 hours later, James found himself pulling up to the Crandall Police Department. It was an unassuming brick building, squat and unwelcoming, with a row of faded squad cars parked haphazardly outside. James stepped out of the Mercedes, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he walked toward the entrance. He had considered calling a lawyer, considered ignoring the summons entirely, but something told him this was a trap. Better to face it head-on than let them twist the story. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and disinfectant. A heavy-set officer manned the front desk, chewing a pen cap as he glanced up. His eyes swept James from head to toe, lingering long enough to feel like an insult. "Can I help you?" "I'm Dr. James Monroe," he said evenly. "Captain Daniels is expecting me." The officer raised an eyebrow, his lips twisting as though trying to suppress a smirk. "Oh, you're the doc, huh?" James didn't respond, his gaze unflinching. "Have a seat," the officer muttered, jerking his thumb toward a row of hard plastic chairs. "I'll let the captain know you're here." James sat down, his back straight and his hands folded tightly in his lap. Across the room, 2 younger officers leaned against a file cabinet, whispering. One of them glanced at James, smirked, and turned back to his colleague. James knew that look. It was the same look he'd seen 100 times growing up. Dismissive, mocking, superior. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours before a door creaked open. "Dr. Monroe," a gruff voice called. James stood, turning to see Captain Daniels, a tall, gray-haired man with a jaw like granite, standing in the doorway. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and his eyes cold as stone. "This way," Daniels said, gesturing. James followed him down a narrow corridor into a small windowless room with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. A metal table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Daniels gestured for James to sit, then closed the door behind them. James waited, his expression calm but guarded. Daniels sat across from him, clasping his hands on the table. "So," he began, his voice low, "you caused quite the stir on Main Street the other day." James raised an eyebrow. "I didn't cause anything, Captain. Your officer stopped me without reason." Daniels leaned back in his chair, a humorless smile tugging at his mouth. "That's not how it looks from our side. Officer Mitchell claims you were hostile, uncooperative." James blinked, stunned at the bold-faced lie. "Hostile?" he echoed, incredulous. "I handed him my license. I asked why I was stopped. That's all." Daniels shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. "We have procedures, Dr. Monroe. You people should understand that." There it was. You people. Two simple words, sharp enough to gut a man. James's jaw tightened. "I'm not sure what you mean, Captain." Daniels tilted his head, his smile growing colder. "Men like you come into towns like this with your fancy cars and your big city arrogance, thinking the rules don't apply. But here's the thing, Doctor, they do." James felt the blood pounding in his ears. "Are you accusing me of something, Captain Daniels?" Daniels leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near growl. "I'm saying that people don't like outsiders stirring up trouble, especially when they don't know their place." James froze. The air in the room grew heavier, colder. Daniels stared at him, waiting for a reaction, a crack in the calm James had worked so hard to maintain. But James wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. He straightened in his chair, his voice steady. "If this is your attempt to intimidate me, Captain, it's a poor one. You and I both know this investigation is nothing more than a smokescreen." Daniel's smile disappeared. "You and your officer violated my rights," James continued, the steel in his voice unmistakable now. "You detained me without cause, and now, instead of admitting fault, you're trying to paint me as the problem." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Doctor. You're starting to sound paranoid." James stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "We're done here." "You walk out that door, Dr. Monroe," Daniels said, rising slowly to his feet. "And you'll regret it." James turned, his voice cold. "No, Captain. I think you're the one who'll regret this." James pushed through the door, his heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through him. He strode past the front desk without a word, his footsteps echoing down the tiled hallway. "Dr. Monroe," a voice called out. James turned sharply to see a young officer approaching, Officer Mitchell, the man who had pulled him over. Mitchell looked uneasy, his face pale and his movements hesitant. "Dr. Monroe," Mitchell said again, glancing nervously toward Daniel's office. Look, I didn't mean." James held up a hand, silencing him. "Save it, officer. You made your choice." Mitchell's shoulders slumped as James turned and walked through the department's glass doors. Outside, the sun was bright, blinding almost, but the air still felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. As he climbed into his car, James reached for his phone. He needed to make a call. In the coming hours, James would reach out to contacts at the hospital board, a lawyer friend in Atlanta, and a journalist whose number he hadn't used in years. He knew the stakes now. This wasn't just about him. Captain Daniels had underestimated him, just as people like Daniels always did. But James Monroe wasn't a man who let injustice stand. Not when the weight of it pressed against everything he had worked for, everything he believed in. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat in his living room, phone in hand, his resolve sharper than ever. "This ends now," he whispered to himself. The first call went out. The fight had begun. James's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel as he navigated the back roads out of Crandall. His Mercedes glided smoothly over the cracked asphalt, but inside, his thoughts raced, turbulent and sharp. "You'll regret it!" Captain Daniels' words echoed like a warning, reverberating in James's mind as he replayed their interaction. He knew a threat when he heard one. He also knew Daniels didn't plan to let this go quietly. Men like Daniels never did. They would protect the illusion of their authority at all costs, even if it meant bending or breaking the law. The digital clock on the dashboard blinked 4:57 p.m. James needed to think, to strategize, but his instincts told him the clock was running out. His phone buzzed again in the cup holder. James glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. He pressed ignore. But this time, the buzzing was followed immediately by a text message. "We know who you are. Monroe, watch yourself." James inhaled sharply, his pulse spiking. He pulled the car to the shoulder of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as the vehicle came to a stop. For a moment, he sat there, staring at the text, his chest rising and falling with deliberate breaths. The message was calculated. A shadowy warning, sent by someone who thought their anonymity made them untouchable. But it wasn't just a threat. It was confirmation. Daniels and his people had been digging into him, pulling strings to intimidate, to silence him. The faint rumble of another car drew his attention. In the rearview mirror, he saw a black pickup truck pulling onto the same stretch of road, headlights glaring in the evening haze. His stomach turned. He didn't need to see the faces to know who it was. "They're following me." James shoved his phone into the center console and pulled back onto the road, his heart hammering. The truck maintained its distance for a while, lurking like a predator just beyond the tree line. Every mile stretched out, thick with tension, until James spotted a convenience store up ahead, a battered gas station at the edge of nowhere, its rusted canopy sagging in the dim light. He pulled into the lot, parking close to the entrance. The pickup rumbled past, its engine growling like a warning, before disappearing down the road. James exhaled slowly, his hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. "Calm down," he told himself. They were testing him, seeing if they could rattle him. But James Monroe wasn't a man who crumbled under pressure. He'd spent years in surgical theaters, steadying his hands while lives hung in the balance. This was no different. He stepped out of the car and entered the store, the bell above the door jangling softly. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of stale coffee. The clerk, a young white man with a scruffy beard, looked up from behind the counter, barely acknowledging James before turning back to his phone. James wandered the aisles, grabbing a bottle of water and a pack of gum, his mind whirling. He had to go beyond just defending himself now. He had to expose what was happening. Daniel's corruption wasn't just about his experience. It was about everyone like him who passed through Crandall and never had the voice, the resources, or the platform to fight back. As he approached the counter, the clerk's phone buzzed audibly. The young man smirked at whatever he saw, his gaze flicking up to James with a spark of recognition. "You're that guy, ain't you?" James frowned, feeling his throat tighten. "Excuse me?" The clerk tapped his phone. "Saw a post about you, some doctor from Atlanta stirring up trouble with the cops. Thought you'd be taller." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The clerk's tone was casual, but the words hit like a gut punch, familiar and dehumanizing all at once. It wasn't enough to just have his credentials questioned. Now he was being reduced to a troublemaker. His success mocked, like it meant nothing. "That'll be $4.29, the clerk said, still smirking. James tossed a $5 bill onto the counter, took his items, and left without another word. Outside, the heat had settled into the earth, thick and oppressive. He climbed back into his car, his mind already spinning through next steps. He needed allies, someone who would listen, who could corroborate his experience. The call for help. Back in Atlanta, James sat in his living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. The events of the day played like a loop in his mind, fueling a quiet but unshakable determination. He dialed a familiar number. "Victor Hayes speaking," the voice on the other end said, after 2 rings. "Victor, it's James Monroe." There was a beat of silence. Then, "James, this is unexpected." Victor Hayes was a civil rights attorney and community activist. James had met years ago, during a charity fundraiser. The man had a reputation for tackling cases others were afraid to touch. "I need your help," James said, cutting to the chase. "There's something happening in Crandall. I was pulled over, harassed, for no reason. Now they're following me. Threatening me." Victor's voice hardened. "Tell me everything." James recounted the traffic stop, the intimidation at the police station, the anonymous messages, and the black pickup following him. Victor listened silently, only interrupting to ask a clarifying question. By the end, his tone was grave. "This isn't just harassment, James," Victor said. "They're trying to scare you into silence, standard playbook for small-town power trips. You're a successful black man who doesn't fit. That alone makes you a threat to them." James ran a hand over his face. So, what do I do? We fight back, Victor replied. You file formal complaints, I'll pull records on Daniel's department, disciplinary histories, body cam policies, all of it. And James. Yes? Victor's voice lowered. Be careful. When people like Daniels feel cornered, they don't just sit quietly. They lash out. The trap. 2 days later, James received a letter, hand-delivered to his hospital office. The envelope was plain, but the seal on the back was unmistakable. Crandall Police Department. His heart pounded as he tore it open. The letter inside was short, typed on official letterhead. Dr. Monroe, you are hereby summoned to appear in Crandall Municipal Court on suspicion of resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. Failure to appear will result in immediate issuance of a warrant for your arrest. Captain Martin Daniels. James's hands shook as he read the words, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice. Fabricated charges, plain and simple. He stood, his mind racing. They were upping the stakes now, turning the screws to drag his name through the mud. If he didn't show, they'd issue a warrant. If he did, they'd humiliate him, make him into the villain. Victor's warning rang in his ears. They don't just sit quietly. They lash out. James grabbed his phone and dialed Victor. They're charging me, James said, his voice tense. Resisting arrest and obstruction, Daniels is framing me. Victor cursed under his breath. They're going for the kill shot. You show up in court and they'll use it to smear you, James, your job, your reputation, they'll go after everything. James sank onto the edge of his desk, his mind spinning. Then what do we do? Victor paused. We beat them at their own game. You go to that courthouse, I'll come with you, and we'll bring the truth with us. How? I'll get the media involved, Victor replied. Public pressure will be our weapon. Daniels wants to play dirty. Let's shine a light on the dirt. James exhaled slowly, the weight of what was coming settling on his shoulders. He had spent years building his life on precision, on control. Now, it felt like he was stepping into chaos. But there was no turning back. Daniels had underestimated him, and James wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everyone who had been silenced under the weight of men like Daniels. Set it up, James said finally. I'll be there. Cliffhanger. The showdown begins. The morning of the court summons, the sky above Crandall was dark with storm clouds. James pulled up to the courthouse, his Mercedes conspicuously out of place against the small-town backdrop. Reporters were already gathering outside, their cameras trained on the entrance. Victor was waiting by the steps, his expression hard. You ready for this? James nodded, his jaw set. More than ever. Together, they climbed the courthouse steps, the sound of cameras clicking like distant gunfire. Behind the double doors, Captain Daniels was waiting, ready to finish what he had started. But James Monroe wasn't a man who backed down, and this time, he wasn't walking in alone. The courthouse loomed ahead, squat and unyielding against the darkened sky. The storm clouds hung heavy, as if the atmosphere itself sensed the conflict brewing inside. James Monroe stepped out of his car, his suit impeccably tailored, his shoulders squared, and his face set with unshakable resolve. He was not the man they expected to walk through those doors, not a defeated target, but a force they could no longer ignore. Beside him, Victor Hayes adjusted his tie and scanned the growing crowd. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras flashing like lightning, the hum of whispered speculation rising like smoke. Let's keep them guessing, Victor muttered, his voice steady. Say nothing, until the time is right. James nodded, his jaw tight. He was ready for this, but the tension coiled in his chest like a spring. Inside that courthouse waited Captain Daniels, a man who had built his authority on intimidation and unchecked power. Today, James would face him head-on, and he wouldn't be walking away quietly. The double doors swung open as they entered, the cool air inside contrasting sharply with the thick humidity outside. A few uniformed officers lingered near the entrance, their eyes flickering toward James with thinly veiled animosity. They didn't expect him to show up, let alone arrive flanked by an attorney like Victor. Courtroom C, a bailiff directed curtly, though his gaze lingered on James as if daring him to falter. James kept walking. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. A sparse audience had gathered, Crandall's townsfolk, curious spectators, and a few people James didn't recognize. At the front of the room, Captain Martin Daniels sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his face a mask of smug confidence. His uniform was pristine, his posture arrogant, as though he already considered this a victory. Daniels' gaze locked on James as he entered, a flicker of something dark flashing behind his cool exterior. Good, James thought. Let him see I'm not afraid. Victor leaned toward him as they took their seats. Remember, they're expecting you to lose your temper. Stay calm. Let me lead. James nodded, though the weight of Daniels' stare pressed against his shoulders. He wouldn't give the man what he wanted. He wouldn't break. All rise, the bailiff called, as the judge, an older man with silver hair and heavy-rimmed glasses, entered the room. Judge Ellison settled into his seat, his gaze sweeping the room. Be seated, he instructed, his voice firm. This hearing is to address the charges brought against Dr. James Monroe, resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. The words hung in the air, ridiculous and fabricated, yet delivered with the weight of law. James forced himself to breathe evenly, his hands resting steady on the table. Daniels rose first, walking with calculated ease to address the court. Your Honor, he began, his voice deep and measured. This is a straightforward matter. Officer Mitchell observed suspicious behavior and acted accordingly. Dr. Monroe refused to cooperate, and in doing so, obstructed a lawful investigation. He turned slightly, his cold gaze landing on James. No one is above the law, Your Honor, not even a doctor from Atlanta. The comment stung, not because it was true, but because of what it implied. Daniels wasn't just prosecuting James, he was making him an example, a warning to others who might think to challenge him. Victor stood smoothly, his presence commanding as he stepped forward. Your Honor, Victor began, these charges are not only baseless, but an egregious abuse of power. The facts speak for themselves. Dr. Monroe was stopped without cause, harassed, and threatened by members of Captain Daniels' department. He turned, leveling his gaze at Daniels. This case is not about obstruction of justice, it's about a systemic problem that thrives on intimidation and prejudice. Daniels' lip twitched, but he said nothing. The judge leaned back, clearly annoyed. Mr. Hayes, accusations of systemic misconduct are irrelevant to the charges at hand. With respect, Your Honor, Victor replied sharply, they are entirely relevant, as they explain the circumstances that led us here. Victor returned to his seat, leaving the room in a thick silence. The judge frowned, flipping through his notes. Finally, he turned toward Daniels. Captain Daniels, we'll hear testimony from Officer Mitchell. Bring him forward. The door at the back of the room opened, and Officer Mitchell entered, his eyes darting nervously across the room before settling on Daniels, as if seeking approval. He approached the witness stand, swallowing hard as he sat. State your name and occupation for the record, the judge instructed. Officer Matthew Mitchell, Crandall Police Department. Victor rose immediately. Officer Mitchell, he began, his tone calm but firm. You claim Dr. Monroe was behaving suspiciously. Can you explain what specifically led you to that conclusion? Mitchell shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He was driving slowly through town in a high-end car. We've had reports of stolen vehicles before. Victor tilted his head. Did Dr. Monroe break any traffic laws? No. Did you find anything illegal in his vehicle? No. Then what reason did you have to believe he was committing a crime? Mitchell faltered, his gaze flickering again to Daniels. The captain's expression was stone cold, but the warning in his eyes was clear. It was just procedure, Mitchell stammered. We're trained to identify possible threats. Victor pounced. And what made Dr. Monroe, a man doing nothing illegal, a possible threat? Mitchell's mouth opened, but no words came out. Daniel's face darkened as the silence stretched on. Victor's voice softened. Officer Mitchell, were you acting under direct orders from Captain Daniels to monitor or intimidate certain individuals passing through town? Mitchell's face paled. I can't answer the question, officer. Mitchell looked down, his voice barely audible. Yes. The room erupted into murmurs. Daniels slammed his hand against the table, his face flushing red. That's enough. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court! Victor turned, his expression triumphant. Your Honor, Officer Mitchell's admission proves that Dr. Monroe was targeted unfairly, part of a broader abuse of power within the Crandall Police Department. Judge Ellison leaned back, looking suddenly weary. Captain Daniels, he said, his voice hard. Is there any truth to these claims? Daniels stood, his face a mask of controlled rage. This is a farce, he growled. That man, he pointed a rigid finger at James, thinks he can waltz into my town and undermine my authority. He's no victim. James rose slowly, his voice calm, but ringing with quiet power. I am a doctor, Captain Daniels, he said evenly. I save lives. I've worked my entire life to earn that car, that title, and the respect that comes with it, and yet you saw me as nothing more than a black man out of place. That's not authority, Captain. That's fear. Daniels' face twisted with fury, but before he could respond, the judge banged his gavel again. Enough, Ellison thundered. Captain Daniels, your behavior is bordering on contempt. Victor turned to James, his voice low. We've got him, he knows it. The room settled into uneasy silence, but James could feel the shift. The cracks in Daniels' armor had begun to show, and for the first time, the weight of the system pressing down on him felt just a little lighter. But it wasn't over yet. The judge looked between the parties, his expression unreadable. I will take this matter under advisement and issue a ruling shortly. Until then, this court is adjourned. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Daniel shot James a final, venomous glare before storming out of the room. Mitchell slumped in his chair, visibly deflated, while Victor clasped James's shoulder with quiet confidence. You did it, Victor said softly. He's cornered now. James nodded, though his heart still pounded. Daniels wasn't finished. He could feel it. Men like Daniels didn't accept defeat gracefully. As they left the courtroom, the storm outside finally broke. Rain pounding against the courthouse steps, James stood beneath the overhang, staring out into the downpour, his mind still racing. Victor leaned close. We're close, James. But be ready. Men like Daniels always have one last move. And James knew he was right. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The rain poured in sheets, battering the courthouse steps and drumming against James Monroe's umbrella. It was relentless, like the storm inside him that refused to subside. The sky overhead churned, gray and unforgiving, as if reflecting the moment that awaited him. James stood beneath the awning, Victor Hayes at his side, their words drowned out by the roar of the downpour. The courthouse doors slammed open, and Captain Martin Daniels emerged, his broad shoulders cutting through the rain. He didn't carry an umbrella. He didn't care. His swagger was confident, arrogant, a man convinced of his untouchability. James stepped forward, his hands steady, his gaze locked on the man who had been the architect of this chaos. Captain Daniels, James called. Daniels froze mid-step, the smug smirk faltering ever so slightly as he turned to face James. His sharp eyes narrowed, taking in the man standing in the rain, undeterred and unafraid. What do you want, Doctor? Daniels said, the word doctor dripping with derision. Haven't you caused enough of a scene for one day? Victor stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. The scene isn't over, Captain. Not until you answer for what you've done. Daniels turned to Victor, his lip curling into a sneer. I don't answer to lawyers who show up in my town to cause trouble. James stepped between them, his voice quiet but razor sharp. This isn't about trouble, Captain. It's about truth, and you're running out of places to hide. Daniels laughed, a deep, guttural sound that didn't reach his eyes. Hide from you. You don't know what you're talking about. James's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had spent years mastering this kind of restraint. Steady hands, clear thoughts, even under the brightest lights. Today would be no different. I know enough, James said coldly. I know you're trying to bury me under lies because you can't stand the fact that someone like me doesn't fit into your small-town box, a man with success, power, and respect. Things you'll never have. Daniel's face flushed, his bravado cracking just a little. You pulled me over without cause, James continued, his voice rising. You harassed me. You tried to intimidate me into silence, and when I didn't bow to your authority, you doubled down and fabricated charges against me. Daniel's jaw tightened, his body stiff as the rain slicked down his face. "You're paranoid, Monroe. You're looking for a reason to be a victim." James took another step forward, unflinching. "And you're looking for someone to bully, because that's the only way you can feel powerful. But here's the thing, Daniels. I'm not afraid of you." The crowd was growing now. Reporters had streamed out of the courthouse, cameras and microphones aimed at the two men locked in this standoff. Daniels looked around, suddenly aware of the attention. His face twisted into something ugly as he turned back to James. "You think you're going to win this?" Daniels spat, his voice low but venomous. "This town has my back, always has, always will. People like you show up thinking you're better than us, flaunting your cars, your titles. But we know who you really are. You're nothing." James felt his pulse spike, but his voice remained steady as stone. "And that's your problem, isn't it? You see someone like me, someone who doesn't need your approval, and you can't stand it, so you use your badge as a weapon to tear us down. But not today, Captain, today. I'm tearing you down." Daniels blinked, caught off guard. "What the hell are you talking about?" James held his gaze. "I filed a formal report. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation is already looking into you. Daniels, every traffic stop, every complaint, every name you buried over the years, they're digging it all up." Daniels' smirk faltered. For the first time, something other than arrogance flickered across his face. Something like fear. "You're lying," Daniels said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Victor stepped forward, brandishing a folder in his hand. "No, Captain, he's not. And just in case you were thinking of burying this like you've buried everything else, you'll be pleased to know the local press and half the major outlets in Atlanta already have copies." Daniels's face drained of color as Victor's words hit him like a hammer. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The weight of the truth, of his crumbling authority, hung over him like a noose. "This is harassment," Daniels hissed, his voice barely audible now. "You've got no proof." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh, we have proof." Victor held up the folder for emphasis. "Body cam footage, officer statements, reports filed and ignored. You've been running this department like your own private fiefdom for years. That ends today." Daniel's breathing grew heavy, his chest rising and falling as his mask of composure cracked. "You think people are going to listen to you?" he barked, his voice desperate. "You think anyone cares about what you have to say?" "They'll listen," James said firmly, "because the truth always finds its way out." The rain seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed, drumming relentlessly against the pavement. Around them, the crowd had grown still, the only movement coming from the reporters angling their cameras to capture every word. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He looked at James with pure, unfiltered rage, like a cornered animal preparing to lash out. "You have no idea what you've started," Daniels growled. "You think you're untouchable, Doctor? You're not, none of you are." James stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Then take your best shot, Captain, because I'm not backing down." Daniels's nostrils flared, his face contorted with frustration, but he didn't move. The weight of the cameras, the eyes of the press, and the accusations hanging over him left him frozen, trapped by the very power he'd spent years abusing. Victor broke the silence. "Captain Daniels, I'd suggest you consult a lawyer. You're going to need one." Daniels' gaze darted to Victor, and then back to James, the realization sinking in he was beaten. Not by force or aggression, but by the truth. A weapon he couldn't suppress. The sound of police sirens split the air. Two black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the crowd. Agents from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation emerged, their movements deliberate and unhurried. Captain Daniels turned pale. "Captain Martin Daniels?" one of the agents called, holding up a badge. "We need you to come with us." Daniels whipped around, furious. "You're joking." The agent shook his head. "We have questions regarding misconduct within your department. You'll need to accompany us to Atlanta for questioning." The crowd erupted in murmurs, cameras flashing wildly. Daniels looked back at James, his face red with rage, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This isn't over," he snarled. James met his glare without flinching. "It is for you." The agents took Daniels by the arm and led him toward the waiting SUVs. The captain struggled at first, his pride refusing to let him go quietly, but eventually, he surrendered to the inevitable. His shoulders slumped in defeat. The rain began to lighten as Daniels disappeared into the back of the black vehicle, the door closing with a final, resounding thud. Victor turned to James, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's a start," he said quietly. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the disappearing SUV. "It's not over yet," he replied, "but it's a step in the right direction." The two men stood side by side on the courthouse steps as the storm broke, the clouds parting just enough for a sliver of light to cut through the darkness. For the first time in days, James allowed himself to breathe. The truth was out now. The fight was far from over. But today, at least today, he had won. The storm had passed by the time James Monroe returned to Atlanta. The sun broke through the clouds as if the world itself had shifted, casting light onto streets slick with rain and onto a man who now carried the weight of something far greater than his own survival. The courthouse steps in Crandall, the accusations, and Daniels' venomous threats lingered like shadows, but their power had diminished. The truth had been set in motion, an unstoppable force that would ripple far beyond the walls of that small, forgotten town. 2 days later, the news broke. Crandall police captain under investigation for misconduct and systemic abuse. The headline spread like wildfire, appearing on local stations and major networks alike. News anchors recounted the details with carefully practiced neutrality, but the story spoke for itself. Daniels' reign of unchecked authority was over. Bodycam footage of Daniels' men, evidence of falsified reports, and sworn testimonies from whistleblowers within his department painted a damning picture. A photograph of Daniels being escorted into an unmarked car ran beneath the scrolling text on the evening news. His face, red, defeated, and stripped of its false bravado, was etched into the screen. James watched from the comfort of his living room, his phone vibrating constantly with calls and messages. Some came from colleagues offering their support, others from news outlets hungry for more details. A few were personal, a quiet "thank you" from people who had passed through towns like Crandall and had no one to speak for them. Victor Hayes sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee as they reviewed the day's headlines. "They'll keep digging," Victor said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Once the GBI starts pulling threads, Daniels won't be the only one to fall. This case is bigger than him." James nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "That's what I'm counting on. It's not just Daniels, it's the system that allowed him to operate unchecked for years." Victor leaned back, studying James for a moment. "You've done something important here, James. Whether you realize it or not, you've started a conversation that people can't ignore anymore." James met his gaze, his voice steady. "It's a start, Victor. That's all it is." The ripple effect of James's stand reached far beyond Crandall. In Atlanta, civil rights organizations held rallies calling for accountability in small-town departments across Georgia. News outlets published editorials dissecting systemic failures and abuses of power, using Daniels as the face of a larger problem. And in Crandall, the silence that had cloaked the town for so long began to break. A week after the confrontation, James received an email from a woman he didn't know, a Crandall resident named Maggie Turner. "Dr. Monroe, I just wanted to say thank you. I've lived in Crandall my whole life, and what happened to you, what Captain Daniels has done to so many people, it's not new, but no one's ever stood up to him before, not like you did. People here are starting to talk. They're not afraid anymore. That's because of you." James read the message twice, his chest tight with emotion. He had never set out to be a hero, never imagined himself as a symbol of anything. He was just a man who refused to let injustice go unanswered. But now, as he sat at his desk in the calm quiet of his home, he realized something profound. Sometimes, standing up for yourself meant standing up for others, too. Despite the media frenzy and Daniels' very public downfall, James knew the fight wasn't over. He felt it in the hushed conversations among some of his colleagues at the hospital, in the sideways glances from those who saw him on the news, and whispered, "That's him." Not all attention was welcome. The backlash from certain corners was inevitable. Anonymous emails dripping with venom, comments on news articles questioning why he didn't just cooperate. The voices were faceless, but their intent was clear: to diminish him, to question his actions, to make him doubt himself. But James had spent a lifetime navigating those voices. They no longer held the same power. His phone buzzed. It was his assistant, Amanda. "Dr. Monroe," she said cheerfully, "you have a visitor. He says he's an officer. Matthew Mitchell. From Crandall?" James paused, surprised. "Send him in." A few minutes later, Officer Mitchell stood in James's office, his posture awkward as he shifted his hat in his hands. Gone was the crisp uniform and the bravado that came with it. Instead, Mitchell looked like a man carrying the weight of regret. "Dr. Monroe," Mitchell began, his voice uncertain, "thank you for seeing me." James gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Mitchell lowered himself into the seat, his gaze flicking briefly to the degrees on the wall, proof of James's hard-earned success. Mitchell sighed, the words struggling to come out. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything I was wrong to follow Daniel's orders, wrong to treat you like I did. I should have known better." James studied him, measuring the sincerity in his words. "Why now, Officer Mitchell?" Mitchell looked up, shame etched across his face. "Because watching Daniel's fall made me realize something. I had a choice, all of us did, and I chose to stay silent because it was easier. But it's people like you, people who fight back, that force guys like me to wake up." James leaned back in his chair, his voice calm. "It's not enough to wake up, officer. What matters is what you do now." Mitchell nodded slowly. "I've already spoken to the GBI. I'm cooperating with their investigation. Daniel's covered for a lot of bad men over the years, and I'm done being part of it." For the first time, James felt a small spark of hope, not just for Mitchell, but for the possibility of change in places like Crandall. "Good," James said finally. "Make sure you follow through." "I will," Mitchell promised. Standing to leave at the door, he hesitated. "And, Dr. Monroe, thank you for not backing down." When the door closed, James sat in silence for a moment, staring out at the city skyline. The work wasn't done. There would be more stories like his, more battles to fight. But the first stone had been cast, and the ripples had begun. A month later, James stood in front of a crowded auditorium at a community town hall in Atlanta. The room buzzed with energy. Students, activists, families, gathered to hear him speak. Victor stood off to the side, giving him a small nod of encouragement. James stepped to the microphone, his voice steady, his presence commanding. "I'm not here today to tell you my story," he began. "You already know it. I'm here to talk about what happens next, about the systems that allow men like Captain Daniels to thrive, and the silence that protects them." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "For too long, we've been told to keep our heads down, to comply, to let it go," James continued. "But compliance won't fix broken systems, silence won't bring justice, and pretending the problem doesn't exist won't make it go away." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Change begins with people willing to stand up, no matter the cost." The room erupted into applause, but James didn't smile. His expression was resolute. The applause wasn't for him, it was for the fight ahead. Late that night, James sat alone on his porch, staring up at the night sky. The stars seemed clearer now, the air crisper. His grandmother had once told him that storms washed away what was old and broken, leaving room for something new to grow. He hadn't understood her words then, but now, as he sat in the stillness, he did. James's phone buzzed, a text lighting up the screen. "Victor. This is just the beginning. You ready for the next step?" James smiled faintly, his fingers hovering over the screen. Finally, he typed back, "I've been ready." The fight wasn't over, it never truly was. But James Monroe was no longer just a doctor. He was a man standing in the storm, unshakable. And this time, he wasn't standing alone. The night was still, the quiet punctuated only by the faint hum of traffic in the distance. James Monroe sat on his porch, a steaming mug of tea cupped between his hands as he gazed up at the stars. The sky was clear now, the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm. The world wiped clean, yet bearing the weight of what had passed. The events of the past few weeks played in his mind like fragments of a dream. Sharp, vivid, and almost surreal. The Crandall courthouse steps, Captain Daniels' venomous words, the silent stares of officers who thought their power would last forever, and then the fallout, the investigations, the media coverage, the conversations happening in homes and community halls all across the state. The storm had swept through his life, unearthing things long buried, but it had also revealed something else: the possibility of change. James had been a man of quiet precision for most of his life. In the operating room, where lives teetered on the edge of a scalpel, he knew how to remain calm, how to focus. It was a skill forged by years of training and a lifetime of learning to navigate the world as a black man, in spaces where he wasn't always welcome. He had grown used to the glances, the assumptions, the casual dismissals that came when others judged him by his skin, instead of his mind. But Crandall had been different. Crandall had forced him to face something he thought he'd mastered long ago. The rage that simmered beneath the surface when his humanity was questioned. The rage that came from being reduced to another man in a nice car. And yet, James had not been broken by it. Instead, he had learned something valuable about himself. He was not just a healer who could hold lives steady in his hands. He was a fighter who refused to let injustice win. For too long, he had focused only on his work, content to let his success speak for itself. But Crandall taught him that silence could be mistaken for acceptance. His silence would not save him, or anyone else who looked like him. It was the noise, the resistance, and the refusal to be dismissed that would make the difference. Sometimes, you had to stand in the storm to change it. Crandall's fallout had shaken more than just Captain Daniels. Within weeks, Daniels' former officers were either placed on administrative leave or resigning outright, unable to deny their roles in the corruption that festered under his leadership. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation expanded its inquiry to surrounding towns, uncovering patterns of abuse that stretched far beyond a single precinct. Local communities began holding meetings, demanding accountability and transparency from their police departments. What started as James Monroe's story had become something bigger, something unstoppable. News outlets called it a reckoning, a long overdue examination of power and prejudice in small-town America. Activists praised James's courage, his refusal to back down in the face of intimidation. He became a symbol of resistance, not because he had sought it, but because he had shown others what was possible when fear didn't win. Victor Hayes had said it best: "One man can't change a system overnight, but he can light the match that sets it in motion." And the fire had been lit. Of course, it wasn't all victory. James knew that. For every step forward, there were whispers in the background, voices claiming he was making trouble or playing victim. Men like Daniel still existed, lurking behind uniforms and badges, holding onto power they hadn't earned. And there were still those who would dismiss stories like his, calling them exaggerations or inconveniences to a narrative they preferred. James had learned to expect it, but he also learned not to let it deter him. Crandall had shown him that silence was complicity, and he refused to be complicit any longer. He would use his voice, his title, his reputation, to fight for the people who didn't have the platform he did. He would stand up, again and again, because the fight for justice wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. One day, one conversation, one battle at a time. A month after the showdown in Crandall, James found himself standing in front of a group of medical students at a lecture hall in Atlanta. The room was packed, young faces watching him with curiosity and admiration. He wasn't here to talk about neurosurgery. Not today. "I spent most of my career believing my work alone would define me," James began, his voice steady. "I thought if I just kept my head down, if I was good enough, no better than everyone else, then the world would treat me fairly." He paused, scanning the room, letting his words sink in. "But fairness isn't something you wait for. It's something you fight for. I learned that the hard way when I was pulled over in a small town not far from here. It didn't matter who I was or what I'd accomplished. My success didn't protect me from their assumptions." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the lights overhead. "Some of you will face this too," James continued. "Maybe not in the same way, but the world will look at you and try to put you in a box. It'll tell you who you are before you even have a chance to speak. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can accept it, or you can resist it, and let me tell you this: resistance matters." The students broke into applause, the sound rising like a wave. James stood tall, feeling their energy, knowing that the next generation was listening, watching and learning. As he left the lecture hall, a young black student approached him, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "Dr. Monroe," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "Thank you for telling the truth. People like me need to hear it." James smiled warmly, his voice gentle. "Keep pushing forward. The truth is our greatest weapon." She nodded, determination flashing in her eyes before she turned to rejoin her classmates. As James stepped into the crisp afternoon air, he felt something shift within him, something light and unburdened. He had been changed by what happened in Crandall, not broken, and while the scars of that experience would remain, they were a reminder of what he had overcome. James sat on his porch that evening, the city skyline stretching in the distance. The world hadn't changed overnight, the system that had enabled Daniels still existed. The fight was far from over. But there was hope. He thought of the residents of Crandall, now standing up for themselves. The young student who would go on to inspire others. The activists and lawyers, like Victor, who worked tirelessly to bring change. Progress is slow, James thought. But it's real. He picked up his phone and began typing an email to Victor. "Let's talk about next steps. There's more work to do." When he hit send, James leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars. He was no longer just Dr. James Monroe, the surgeon with steady hands. He was a man who had walked through fire and come out stronger on the other side. A man who refused to be silent in a world that demanded it. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew this. Change didn't come from waiting. It came from standing up, from speaking out, and from refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. And as long as there were voices to be heard, people to fight for, and truths to uncover, James Monroe would be there, unshakable, unrelenting, and ready. The storm had passed, but its lessons would remain. The fight was just beginning,